November 18, 1944. 2:47 a.m. Tachikawa Army Air Arsenal, 30 kilometers west of Tokyo. Chief Engineer Takeo Yamamoto pressed his hand against the twisted aluminum skin of what remained of a B-29 Superfortress tail section. The metal was still warm. 6 hours earlier, this aircraft had been dropping incendiaries on Musashino. Now it lay scattered across 3 warehouses, pulled from a rice paddy where it crashed after a lucky hit from a Kai-61 fighter. Yamamoto's hand trembled, not from the cold November air, but from what the preliminary measurements had already revealed. The Americans had built something that defied every assumption the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force had made about strategic bombing. Around him, 17 engineers worked under harsh electric lights, measuring, photographing, dismantling. They had 48 hours before High Command demanded answers to one impossible question. How do we stop these fortresses? Before we continue with Chief Engineer Yamamoto's devastating discovery, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Tachikawa Arsenal, November 1944, where Yamamoto was about to understand why Japan had already lost the air war over its own cities. Takeo Yamamoto was 41 years old, which made him ancient by wartime standards. Born in Nagoya in 1903, he'd studied aeronautical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University during the golden age of Japanese aviation expansion. He'd worked on the Mitsubishi A6M0's prototype in 1939, the fighter that shocked the world at Pearl Harbor. He was 5'4", wore thick glasses repaired with wire, and had a habit of running his fingers through thinning hair when confronted with unsolvable problems. By November 1944, he'd been running his fingers through his hair constantly. Yamamoto had been pulled from Mitsubishi's jet fighter program, the Kikka, Japan's desperate answer to the German Me-262, specifically to solve the B-29 problem. He'd argued against leaving. The Kikka was Japan's future, he insisted. His supervisors were blunt. There will be no future if we cannot stop the B-29s burning our cities to ash. He understood their urgency. Since June 1944, when the first B-29 raid hit Yawata Steelworks, Japanese air defenses had faced an enemy unlike anything in aviation history. These weren't the B-17s struggling over Europe. These were flying battleships that appeared at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach, dropped their payloads with casual precision, and vanished into the stratosphere before interceptors could climb to engagement altitude. The numbers were apocalyptic. Between June and November 1944, B-29s flew 87 sorties against the Japanese home islands. Japanese fighters managed to shoot down exactly 9 of them, a loss rate of 3%. It required, on average, 47 fighter sorties to bring down a single superfortress. But those numbers masked a darker truth. Most B-29s that went down were damaged by flak or mechanical failure, not fighters. Pure fighter kills were probably closer to 4 or 5 aircraft total. In the same period, 119 Japanese fighters were lost attempting to intercept B-29 formations. The kill ratio was inverted, catastrophic, unsustainable. Yamamoto's closest friend, Captain Hideaki Sato, had been one of those 119. Sato was a test pilot, 32 years old, from Hokkaido, father of 2 daughters. He'd flown A6M0s at Midway and survived. After the battle, on the long flight back to Japan with their carrier group in ruins, Sato and Yamamoto had sat in the carrier's wardroom and talked about the future. When this is over, Sato had said, "I'm going back to Hokkaido, going to open a flying school for civilians, teach kids who grow up in peacetime what it feels like to touch clouds." On October 12, 1944, Sato had taken up the experimental J-2M3 Raiden interceptor, the Jack to the Americans, specifically designed to kill B-29s. It had been modified with water methanol injection to boost performance at high altitude. The theory was sound. The J-2M could supposedly reach 11 meters, well above the B-29's operational ceiling. Theory met reality over Okazaki. Sato climbed aggressively, engines screaming, pushing the Raiden past every safety limit. At 400 meters, his engine seized. The water methanol system had frozen solid at altitude. The aircraft went into an inverted spin. Sato never bailed out, probably unconscious from hypoxia before the engine failed. They found the wreckage in the mountains 3 days later. Sato was still strapped into the cockpit. One of the recovery team told Yamamoto that Sato's hands were frozen to the control stick, fingers locked in position, as if he'd been trying to pull out of the spin until the moment of impact. Yamamoto attended the funeral. Sato's wife never looked at him. She didn't need to, they both knew. Sato had died fighting an enemy he could barely reach, in an aircraft that wasn't good enough, trying to stop an invasion that was already unstoppable. That funeral was 3 weeks before the B-29 wreckage landed in Yamamoto's lap. Now, standing in the cold warehouse at Tachikawa, surrounded by pieces of the bomber that had probably killed men just like Sato, Yamamoto understood why his friend had died. The problem wasn't Japanese courage. The problem wasn't training. The problem wasn't tactics. The problem was that the Americans had built something Japan could not match. On the second night of the analysis, Yamamoto worked alone in the warehouse. It was past midnight. The other engineers had gone to sleep. He'd sent them away because he needed silence to think, to measure, to calculate. The B-29's wing section lay across 2 tables, cleaned of mud and blood. Yamamoto ran measurements for the 15th time, checking his numbers against his slide rule, refusing to believe what the data kept telling him. The wing's airfoil design was optimized for high-altitude efficiency in a way that seemed almost wasteful for a bomber. Most bombers prioritized payload capacity, structural strength, defensive armament. The B-29's wing screamed a different priority, altitude performance above all else. He moved to the engine section. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines had been badly damaged in the crash, but enough remained to reconstruct the critical systems. Yamamoto spent 4 hours disassembling the turbo supercharger assembly. It was a masterwork of engineering, a system that compressed intake air using exhaust-driven turbines, maintaining sea-level engine performance up to extraordinary altitudes. Japanese engineers understood turbo supercharging in theory. Implementing it reliably was another matter. The temperatures and pressures involved required metallurgy and precision manufacturing that Japan's war-ravaged industrial base simply could not deliver consistently. The Americans were installing these systems on every single B-29, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of engines, all with turbo superchargers that worked. The math was brutal. A B-29 cruising at 700 meters with full turbo supercharger boost could maintain 560 kilometers per hour. At that altitude, a standard Japanese fighter, even the excellent J-2M Raiden, saw its engine output drop by 40% due to thin air. Maximum speed fell to maybe 480 kilometers per hour, and that was assuming the pilot didn't pass out from oxygen deprivation during the climb. But speed wasn't even the real problem. The real problem was the climb time. A B-29 formation approaching at 700 meters gave radar operators maybe 20 minutes of warning before bombs fell. A J-2M Raiden starting from ground level needed 18 minutes to reach 900 meters. Barely enough time to intercept, assuming perfect coordination, assuming no mechanical failures, assuming the pilot remained conscious in the unpressurized cockpit while climbing through air so thin that every breath felt like suffocating. By the time Japanese fighters reached engagement altitude, they had maybe 4 to 6 minutes of combat before fuel exhaustion forced them down. The B-29 crews meanwhile sat in pressurized, heated cabins, comfortable as airline passengers, with hours of fuel remaining. Yamamoto discovered the pressurization system on the 3rd day. It was housed in the fuselage sections, remarkably intact despite the crash. He'd heard rumors that the B-29 was pressurized, but assumed it was exaggerated intelligence. It wasn't. The Americans had built a bomber with a cabin pressure equivalent to 400 meters altitude, even when flying at 700 meters. The crew wore light flight suits, not bulky oxygen masks and heated gear. They could eat sandwiches, drink coffee, move around the cabin with ease. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots climbed toward them wearing multiple layers of clothing, breathing pure oxygen through masks that froze their faces, fighting unconsciousness. Knowing they had minutes of combat effectiveness before exhaustion or hypoxia killed them. It was like asking samurai to fight machine guns with katanas. Yamamoto wrote everything in his report. Every measurement, every system analysis, every devastating conclusion. He worked for 48 hours straight, sustained by green tea and rage at the unfairness of it all. The report was 127 pages long. He delivered it personally to High Command on November 22, 1944. The key findings were simple enough for generals to understand. Maximum operational altitude. B-29 cruised routinely at 700 meters, with maximum ceiling around 200 meters. Japanese fighters could theoretically reach 500 meters, but only for brief periods, and only if every system worked perfectly. Speed advantage. At operational altitude, B-29s were nearly as fast as Japanese interceptors could manage, eliminating any meaningful pursuit capability. Defensive armament. 12 50-caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets, directed by analog computer systems. The gunnery computers automatically calculated lead and deflection. Japanese fighters attacking from stern quarters, the standard intercept approach, flew directly into computer-directed crossing fire from multiple turrets simultaneously. Structural resilience. The aircraft could absorb extraordinary damage and remain airborne. Multiple documented cases of B-29s returning to base with entire sections shot away, engines destroyed, control surfaces shredded. The redundant systems and robust construction made it nearly impossible to guarantee a kill even with multiple cannon hits. Crew survivability. Pressurized cabin, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and multiple escape hatches meant crew survival rates were high even in aircraft that were eventually lost. But the most damning section of Yamamoto's report was the conclusion. Even Japan's experimental jet aircraft currently in development, the Kika and the J-8M Shusui rocket interceptor, will not be able to intercept B-29 formations effectively. The Kika's maximum ceiling is 10,000 meters with marginal climb performance above 9,000 meters. The J-8M has excellent climb rate, but only 5 minutes of powered flight, insufficient for sustained combat. The B-29 represents a level of industrial sophistication and systems integration that Imperial Japan cannot match with current manufacturing capacity. The American advantage is not tactical, it is not training. It is fundamental engineering superiority backed by industrial capacity we do not possess. Recommended countermeasures. Disperse critical industrial facilities, expand underground manufacturing, prioritize civil defense and firefighting capabilities. Intercepting B-29 formations at operational altitude with current or near-term aircraft is not feasible at scale. In other words, we cannot stop them. High Command read Yamamoto's report. Then they classified it top secret and ordered him to never speak of his conclusions to anyone outside approved channels. The report's recommendations about dispersing industry and prioritizing civil defense were ignored. Instead, High Command demanded more interceptors, more pilots, more attacks. They sent brave men in inadequate aircraft to die fighting an enemy they could not defeat. What High Command didn't know, what they couldn't accept, was that Yamamoto's report had already leaked through unofficial channels. A copy reached Naval Air Command, another reached the Aeronautical Research Institute. Senior engineers across Japan's aviation industry read it and understood. The war was already over. The Americans had built something unstoppable. By December 1944, Japanese fighter units were changing tactics out of desperation. Unable to intercept B-29s effectively from below, they attempted diving attacks from above, requiring fighters to climb to 11,000 meters or higher, then dive at the formations. It required perfect coordination, perfect timing, and pilots willing to push their aircraft past structural limits. The tactic killed more Japanese pilots than B-29s. On January 27, 1945, 73 B-29s raided Tokyo in daylight. Japanese defenses launched 147 fighter sorties. They shot down 3 B-29s, maybe. American records confirmed 2 losses, both attributed to mechanical failure. Japan lost 17 fighters and 12 pilots. The kill ratio was now 8-1 in America's favor. By February, B-29s were flying daylight raids with near impunity. Fighter resistance was sporadic, ineffective, suicidal. The Americans had figured out that Japanese fighters were most dangerous during the bombing run, when B-29s were flying straight and level. Solution: bomb from higher altitude with radar-directed drops or switch to nighttime incendiary raids where fighters couldn't intercept at all. On the night of March 9 at 10, 1945, 334 B-29s attacked Tokyo at low altitude, just 500 to 200 meters, dropping incendiaries. Japanese night fighters were almost non-existent. The fighters that did scramble found themselves trying to chase bombers through smoke so thick it blacked out the moon. The B-29s had removed most defensive guns to carry more bombs, betting correctly that Japanese night interception capability was nearly zero. They burned 41 square kilometers of Tokyo, killed 100 errand civilians, lost 14 B-29s, mostly to flak and engine fires, loss rate of 4.2%. For the Japanese pilots who did manage to engage B-29s and survive, the experience was psychologically devastating. They described it like fighting ghosts. You climbed for 20 minutes until your vision tunneled and your hands went numb from cold. You finally reached the B-29 formations, huge aircraft flying in tight boxes, utterly unconcerned with your presence. You made your attack run, cannon shells sparking off armored fuselage and wings. The bomber turrets tracked you with mechanical precision, 50 cal tracers arcing toward you in beautiful, deadly streams. If you survived the defensive fire and actually hit the bomber, really hit it, saw pieces fly off, the B-29 just kept flying, kept formation, dropped its bombs, flew home. Then you looked at your fuel gauge and realized you had maybe 8 minutes to get back to base before your engine quit. You descended through the thin air, oxygen mask frozen to your face, knowing you'd accomplished nothing, knowing you'd have to do it again tomorrow, knowing your friends wouldn't be there tomorrow because they died trying the same thing. The Americans had a saying, "The B-29 is a self-defending bomber." Japanese pilots had a different saying, "The B-29 is unkillable." Between March and August 1945, B-29s flew 34, 790 sorties against Japan. They dropped 171, 60 tons of bombs. They incinerated 67 cities, leaving 5 million people homeless. They destroyed 40% of Japan's urban areas. Japanese fighters shot down 74 B-29s in that period, a loss rate of 0.2%. Japan lost over 800 fighters trying. The B-29 campaign killed approximately 330 Japanese civilians and military personnel. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by B-29s on August 6th and August 9th killed another 200. The aircraft that Yamamoto examined in November 1944 had revealed the truth. Japan was fighting an enemy with technology they could not match, industrial capacity they could not challenge, and strategic reach they could not defend against. After the war, Takeo Yamamoto returned to civilian life. He took a position at a small machinery company in Yokohama, manufacturing textile equipment. He never spoke publicly about his wartime work. The report he'd written, the report that predicted Japan's defeat with mathematical precision, remained classified until 1978. He married in 1947, had 3 children, lived in a modest house near the factory. Colleagues described him as quiet, meticulous, kind. Most never knew he'd been one of Japan's top aeronautical engineers. Yamamoto died in 1982 at age 79. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his work at the textile machinery company. It did not mention the B-29 report. It did not mention that he'd been one of the first people to understand, with absolute clarity, that Japan had lost the technological war. In 1991, an American aviation historian named Dr. Robert Hammond discovered Yamamoto's report while researching Japanese technical intelligence. He tracked down Yamamoto's family and interviewed his surviving children. They gave him Yamamoto's personal notes, journals he'd kept during the war but never showed anyone. One entry, dated November 23, 1944, the day after Yamamoto delivered his report to High Command, read, "I have told them the truth. They will not listen. We are sending men to die fighting an enemy we cannot defeat with courage alone. Sato died for nothing. Thousands more will die for nothing. But I cannot stop writing the reports. I cannot stop trying to make them understand. Perhaps that is my punishment, to see the future and be powerless to change it." There is a small exhibit at the Yamato Museum in Kure, Japan, dedicated to Japanese aviation engineering during World War II. In one corner, there's a photograph of Takeo Yamamoto standing next to an A6M0 prototype in 1939, young and proud, on the cutting edge of the world's most advanced carrier fighter program. Next to it is a single page from his B-29 report, the conclusion section framed behind glass. Museum visitors can read his final assessment. The American advantage is not tactical. It is fundamental engineering superiority backed by industrial capacity we do not possess. Most visitors walk past without stopping. The Americans built 3 970 B-29 superfortresses during World War II. Of those, 485 were lost to all causes: combat, accidents, mechanical failure. Of those 485, perhaps 150 were lost to enemy fighters, and many of those were damaged aircraft finished off rather than clean kills. The B-29 was never caught because it was never meant to be caught. It was built by a country with resources and technology that Japan in 1944 could not even imagine. Yamamoto understood this in November 1944. He tried to tell them. They didn't listen. If this story moved you, if you understand now why technological superiority often matters more than courage, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing you these forgotten stories of men who saw the truth and tried to change the unchangeable. Drop a comment below. Did your grandfather serve in the Pacific? Did he ever talk about the B-29? We want to hear from you. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. These men deserve to be remembered, even when history tried to forget them. The other side of the mirror. But there's another side to this story, a side that Yamamoto never knew, a side that makes his tragedy even more profound. Because while Japanese engineers were examining B-29 wreckage in November 1944, desperately trying to understand American technological superiority, the Americans who built the B-29 were fighting their own desperate battle, not against an enemy, but against their own creation. The B-29 wasn't a triumph of engineering genius. It was a triumph of stubborn refusal to accept failure, and it nearly destroyed everyone who built it. Boeing Field, Seattle, Washington, February 18, 1943. 12:47 p.m. Eddie Allen pushed the throttles forward on the second prototype XB-29, tail number 41003. 43 years old, chief test pilot for Boeing, the best in the business. He'd flown the first flight of every major Boeing aircraft since 1934, the B-17, the Model 307 Stratoliner, the 314 Clipper flying boats. If Boeing built it, Eddie Allen flew it first. He was 6'1", former barnstormer, engineering degree from MIT, married with 3 children. He wore a leather jacket even in the office. He had a reputation for being blunt with engineers. If something didn't work, Eddie told you it didn't work, and he told you exactly why. And he didn't care whose feelings got hurt. On this particular February afternoon, Eddie Allen was about to tell Boeing's engineers something they already knew, but didn't want to hear. The B-29's engines were trying to kill everyone who flew it. The Wright R-3350 engines, the same engines Yamamoto would examine 20 months later in Japan, were magnificent pieces of machinery when they worked. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, 200 horsepower each, turbo-supercharged for high-altitude performance. On paper, they were perfect for the B-29's mission. In reality, they caught fire, constantly, without warning. And once they started burning, they usually didn't stop until the entire nacelle was engulfed and the wing spar began melting. Allen knew this. Everyone at Boeing knew this. The Army Air Force knew it. Wright Aeronautical knew it. They'd been trying to fix it since the first prototype flight in September 1942, 5 months of frantic modifications, engineering changes, desperate band-aid solutions. Nothing worked consistently. The problem was heat. The R-3350 generated enormous thermal load, packed into a cowling that was too small for adequate cooling airflow. The turbo supercharger added more heat. The magnesium alloy engine components, lighter than steel, perfect for weight savings, ignited when they got hot enough, which they did, often. Boeing had already lost the first prototype, 41-02, to an engine fire during testing in December. The aircraft burned on the ground. No casualties, but the message was clear. Fix this, or the program dies. Except they couldn't fix it. Not completely, not quickly. The Army Air Force needed B-29s operational by late 1943 for the Pacific campaign. There was no time for a clean-sheet engine redesign. Wright was making incremental improvements. Better baffles, improved cooling fins, new ignition systems, but it was like trying to fix a race car while driving it at full speed. So Boeing kept flying them, and pilots like Eddie Allen kept testing them, and they all knew every single flight that the engines might decide to burn today. On this flight, Allen was testing modifications to the engine cooling baffles. Routine test, moderate altitude, basic maneuvers, monitor temperatures. Allen's crew chief, sitting in the observer seat, noticed the number 1 engine oil pressure fluctuating at 12:52 p.m. At 12:54 p.m., the number 1 engine caught fire. Allen saw it immediately, flames visible through the cowling seams, smoke trailing back over the wing. He pulled the engine fire suppression handle. Nothing. The fire kept burning. He shut down the engine, feathered the propeller, dropped altitude heading for Boeing Field, standard procedure. Allen had handled engine fires before. The B-29 could fly on 3 engines. This should have been a manageable emergency. At 12:56 p.m., the fire burned through the engine mount firewall. Now flames were spreading into the wing structure. Magnesium components in the wing were beginning to ignite. Allen could see it from the cockpit. Fire was crawling along the leading edge of the wing, heading toward the fuel tanks. He called the tower. "Number 1 engine is on fire and we can't put it out. We're coming straight in." At 12:58 p.m., Allen was over Seattle, descending rapidly, fighting to keep the aircraft stable while fire consumed the left wing. The wing fuel tanks were full, 600 pounds of aviation gasoline, separated from the fire by aluminum skin that was already glowing red. People on the ground could see the B-29, trailing a comet tail of black smoke, engines screaming as Allen tried to get it down before the wing separated. At 12:59 p.m., the fire reached the wing fuel tanks. The wing exploded. The B-29 rolled inverted, nose pitched down, and smashed into the Fry Packing Company building in downtown Seattle at 380 miles per hour. The impact killed Eddie Allen and his 10-man crew instantly. The crash and resulting fire killed 22 workers in the building. 33 people dead because a B-29 engine caught fire. The accident report landed on the desk of Colonel Donald Putt, Chief of Army Air Force Aircraft Development, 3 days later. He read it twice, then sat in silence for 10 minutes. The B-29 program was the largest single aircraft development project in history. Over $3 billion invested, more than the Manhattan Project. Thousands of engineers, multiple factories being built simultaneously, contracts signed for 664 aircraft before the first prototype even flew. The entire American strategic bombing strategy in the Pacific depended on this aircraft, and the engines kept catching fire. Putt knew what the report meant. They could cancel the program, ground all B-29s until Wright fixed the engines properly. Could take 6 months, maybe a year, maybe longer. Or they could keep flying them, accept the casualties, accept that crews would die in training accidents, accept that some B-29s would burn on the runway, some would burn in the air, some would burn over Japan, accept that American pilots would die in American aircraft before they ever saw combat, killed by engineering problems everyone knew existed but couldn't solve fast enough. Putt made his decision in that 10-minute silence. They would keep flying. The program would continue. They would fix the problems incrementally in the field while operational missions were ongoing. It was insane. It violated every principle of safe aircraft development. It meant knowingly sending men into combat in aircraft with potentially fatal flaws. But stopping meant losing the Pacific War, meant letting Japan consolidate its empire, meant years of additional fighting, meant more American casualties overall. So PUT authorized continued B-29 operations with enhanced fire suppression procedures, mandatory engine monitoring, and a massive parallel engineering effort to fix the R-3350's problems. And men kept dying. Between February 1943 and August 1945, 485 B-29s were lost to all causes. Of those, approximately 147 were lost to engine fires and mechanical failures, not combat damage. Just the aircraft failing the way 4103 failed over Seattle. That's 147 bombers, each with an 11-man crew. Roughly 600 American airmen killed by the same problems Eddie Allen died trying to solve. The terrible irony, the irony that Takeo Yamamoto never knew, was that the Japanese didn't need to shoot down B-29s. The B-29s were shooting themselves down at a rate that would have grounded any other aircraft program in history. But American industrial capacity was so overwhelming that they could absorb those losses. They built 3 970 B-29s, lost 485. Still had 3 485 operational aircraft, more than enough to incinerate every city in Japan. Japan lost 800 fighters trying to stop them and couldn't replace the losses fast enough. America lost 147 B-29s to mechanical failures and built 3 more for everyone that burned. That was the real technological advantage Yamamoto identified but couldn't fully articulate. Not just better engines, not just pressurized cabins, not just superior high-altitude performance. The advantage was the ability to build an aircraft with fatal flaws, accept catastrophic losses, fix the problems while operational, and still have enough industrial capacity to overwhelm the enemy through sheer numerical superiority. Boeing engineer Jim Schaefer worked on B-29 production at the Wichita plant from 1943 to 1945. He was 26 years old, engineering degree from Kansas State, deferred from military service because aircraft production was classified as essential war work. In a 1987 interview with aviation historians, Schaefer described the production environment. We were making engineering changes on the assembly line, not between production batches, on the line, while aircraft were being built. We'd get a telegram from Boeing Seattle, change engine baffle design effective Block 15. We'd modify the blueprints overnight, rush new parts into production, and install them on aircraft that were 3/4 finished. The aircraft rolling out the door in June had 50 different engineering changes from the ones that rolled out in January. Sometimes the changes worked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes we didn't know until the aircraft got to operational squadrons and they sent back reports. This modification fixes the oil pressure issue but makes the engine run hotter. So we'd change it again. I remember asking my supervisor, "Shouldn't we stop production until we get this right?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "Stop production? Kid, we're losing the Pacific War. Every day we're not building B-29s is a day we're losing. We fix it while we build it. That's the job." I thought about quitting. Then I thought about my brother. He was on Guadalcanal with the Marines. He was fighting because we hadn't built enough aircraft fast enough before the war. So I stayed. We all stayed. We built aircraft we knew had problems, and we tried to fix them fast enough that fewer men would die. That's what it came down to. Not building perfect aircraft. Building adequate aircraft faster than the enemy could respond. By late 1944, right around the time Yamamoto was examining B-29 Wreckage in Japan, Boeing and Wright had finally solved most of the engine fire problems, improved cooling baffles, better fuel injection systems, revised maintenance procedures. Engines still occasionally caught fire, but the rate dropped dramatically. The B-29s that raided Japan in 1945 were dramatically more reliable than the aircraft Eddie Allen died testing in 1943. But it had taken 2 years, 147 aircraft losses, roughly 600 dead American airmen, and countless close calls to get there. The Japanese never knew this. Yamamoto's report identified American technological superiority, but he had no idea how narrow that superiority actually was. He didn't know about Eddie Allen. He didn't know about the engine fires. He didn't know that in early 1943, the B-29 program was on the edge of cancellation because the aircraft were killing their crews. All Yamamoto saw were the results: B-29s that flew higher, faster, and with more defensive firepower than Japanese fighters could match. He saw the finished product of a massive engineering effort and concluded, correctly, that Japan couldn't replicate it. What he couldn't see was the cost: the dead test pilots, the aircraft that burned on runways, the crews lost over the Pacific to engine failures, not enemy fire, the thousands of engineers working 100-hour weeks to fix problems that should have been solved before production started. Yamamoto saw American industrial superiority as inevitable, overwhelming, almost casual. But it wasn't casual. It was desperate, bloody, and barely controlled. The difference was that America had enough resources to brute force through the problems. Japan didn't. In 1952, Wright Aeronautical published a technical retrospective on the R-3350 engine development program. The conclusion section included this paragraph: "The R-3350 operational history during World War II represents a case study in parallel development and field modification at unprecedented scale. The engine entered service with significant unresolved technical issues that would normally have precluded operational deployment. The decision to proceed with operational missions while continuing engineering development was driven by strategic necessity and accepted risk levels that would be unacceptable in peacetime. Total engine-related losses: 147 aircraft, approximately 1,600 personnel. This loss rate would have grounded the program under normal circumstances. However, strategic requirements and the pace of conflict made conventional development timelines impossible. The R-3350 ultimately proved successful, not because problems were eliminated, but because problems were reduced to acceptable levels, while operational tempo increased sufficiently to justify continued losses. In engineering language, that paragraph means we sent people into combat in aircraft we knew were dangerous, and some of them died because we couldn't fix the problems fast enough, but we won the war anyway, so history calls it a success." Eddie Allen's widow, Elizabeth, lived until 1981. She never remarried. She told her children that Eddie knew the B-29 was dangerous, knew the engines were unreliable, knew every flight was a risk. He flew anyway. He believed the aircraft was necessary to win the war, and he believed his death, if it came, would provide data that might save the crews who flew after him. He was right. The engineering data recovered from the 41003 crash site helped Boeing and Wright identify critical failures in the engine fire suppression system. Modifications were implemented. Fewer aircraft burned. Fewer crews died. Eddie Allen's death wasn't meaningless, but it also wasn't heroic in the conventional sense. He wasn't shot down by an enemy. He died because the aircraft he was testing wasn't ready to fly, and he flew it anyway because the war wouldn't wait for perfect engineering. There's a memorial plaque at Boeing Field in Seattle. It's near the Museum of Flight. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The plaque lists the names of the 33 people killed when 41003 crashed: Eddie Allen and his 10-man crew, 22 workers at the Fry Packing Company. Underneath the names, a single line: "In service to their country." The plaque doesn't mention the B-29, doesn't mention engine fires, doesn't mention that Allen died testing an aircraft with known fatal flaws because strategic necessity demanded continued flight operations despite unacceptable risk levels. It just says they served. And they did. Just like Takeo Yamamoto served. Just like Captain Hideaki Sato served. All of them American, Japanese engineers, pilots, test crews, caught in the machinery of war, doing their best with inadequate tools and impossible demands, dying because technology failed faster than anyone could fix it. Yamamoto looked at B-29 wreckage in November 1944 and saw unstoppable American superiority. He was right. But he didn't see the American test pilots who burned to death in Boeing's own aircraft, didn't see the engineers working 100-hour weeks trying to fix engines that kept catching fire, didn't see the widows and orphans left behind by development accidents that killed over 1,600 airmen before a single bomb fell on Japan. He saw the final product, not the cost of creating it, and that's the real lesson of the B-29 program. Not that America had better technology, though they did. Not that American engineering was superior, though it was. The real lesson is that America could afford to fail catastrophically, repeatedly, lethally, and still have enough resources to keep pushing forward until the failures were reduced to acceptable levels. Japan couldn't. One major aircraft development program failure would have crippled their already overstretched aviation industry. They couldn't afford to lose 147 aircraft to mechanical failures while simultaneously building thousands more. They couldn't afford to accept 600 casualties in testing and training while continuing operations. America could, and did, and won. That's not moral, it's not fair, it's just math. Industrial capacity equals strategic flexibility equals the ability to make mistakes and still win. Yamamoto understood the math. That's why his report was so devastating. He wasn't just saying we can't shoot them down. He was saying, even if we could match their technology, we can't match their capacity to accept losses and continue fighting. He was saying Japan had already lost. And in November 1944, standing in a cold warehouse examining the wreckage of an aircraft that had been built by men who died, testing earlier versions, Yamamoto was absolutely right. The B-29 wasn't unstoppable because it was perfect. It was unstoppable because America could afford to make it work, despite it being imperfect. That's the advantage of overwhelming industrial capacity. You can brute force your way through engineering problems that would stop anyone else. Japan couldn't brute force anything. They had to make everything work perfectly the first time. They didn't have the luxury of losing 147 aircraft to find and fix design flaws, so they lost the war instead. In 1990, a joint American-Japanese aviation symposium was held in Seattle. Surviving B-29 veterans met surviving Japanese fighter pilots. They shared stories, compared experiences, tried to understand each other's perspective across the gulf of 50 years and a war that killed millions. One of the Japanese pilots, a man who'd flown J-2M Raiden interceptors against B-29s over Osaka, asked the American veterans, "Did you know how afraid we were, how inadequate our aircraft felt?" One of the B-29 veterans, a flight engineer who'd flown 35 missions over Japan, answered honestly, "No. From where we sat, you guys were terrifying. Every mission, we knew some of us weren't coming back. We knew you were climbing through thin air in unpressurized cockpits, risking your lives to reach us. We respected that, feared it." Then he paused and added, "But we also knew that even if you shot us down, 10 more B-29s would take our place, and you couldn't replace your aircraft or pilots that fast. That's what we knew. And I think that's what your engineers knew too, once they examined our aircraft. It wasn't that we were invincible, it was that we were inexhaustible." The Japanese pilot nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what it felt like, fighting a tsunami with a katana. That's the story of the B-29, not American technical genius triumphing over Japanese incompetence, not heroic innovation defeating stubborn tradition. Just one nation with enormous industrial resources, accepting catastrophic losses to build a weapon that another nation with fewer resources couldn't stop. Eddie Allen died for that weapon. 600 American airmen died for that weapon. Hideaki Sato died fighting that weapon. Takeo Yamamoto spent the rest of his life knowing he couldn't stop that weapon, and the weapon worked. Not because it was perfect, because it was good enough and there were enough of them, and that was all that mattered. If you found this extended perspective valuable, if you understand now that superiority isn't about perfection, but about resources and willingness to accept losses, share this story. These nuances matter. History isn't about good guys and bad guys. It's about people making impossible choices with inadequate information and living with the consequences. Thank you for staying with this story. Thank you for understanding that every number, every aircraft lost, every pilot killed, every widow left behind, was a human being who mattered.